Welcome to Floor 91, where you can bring in a pretty normal team, but you're going to have to put in a good chunk of strategy. What's going on, guys, and welcome back. My name's Armin. Today we're going to be going over Floor 91, which is the Charlotte floor, which actually has a ton more strategy than your average floor does. So we'll start this first by just talking through the team composition that we ended up taking, and then talking through like different ways that you could maybe play this depending on what compositions you can easily make yourself. So to start it off, this floor ends up having sort of a weird rotation when it comes to trying to control the debuffs you put on the boss, which we'll talk about in the strategy once we get there. But because of that, I ended up going with a relatively safe team. The healer that we chose was Angelic Montmorancy, who, especially in this particular one, because I'm only taking one healer, you really do need Rod of Amaryllis or some kind of like extra healing that you can give her here, because she's mostly good for getting rid of tons of debuffs that are going to exist, and you really can't survive if the defense down gets put on your team. It's really, really hard to live through that. So extra healing there, but she has the S2 and the S3 to be able to get rid of debuffs as well as to keep her team alive. Phenomenal choice, super free to play character, just get the specialty change done, and she's definitely amazing here. Moving on to our Aureus wielding tank, we decided to go with Crimson Armin. Crimson Armin is so good when it comes to just the ability to obviously have like immunity for your team as well as invulnerability. Although the boss strips buffs all the time, so the buffs really aren't super huge. The main reason we chose Crimson Armin is, number one, we don't have a class disadvantage, so if we were using a green tank, we would get crit constantly by the boss. That's stated in the third ability if you read through that, as well as the reality that she can be an Aureus wielder that also sort of fills that niche of Adamant Shield. There's a lot of AoE damage in this particular fight, so being able to have control of both of those defensive sort of modules for your team is really, really nice. If you don't have Crimson Armin, which is pretty likely for a lot of people, a big and amazing character that I've become a really huge advocate of building, especially since Display Unit actually showed me this one, is Eaton. Eaton is literally insane. He does the exact same types of things as Crimson Armin, except that Eaton can be built even bigger, has an even better Aureus internally built, and you would put an Adamant Shield as the artifact on Eaton to do a very, very similar role filling to Crimson Armin. Also a light unit, so if you don't have Crimson Armin, I would suggest that particular tank of all the tanks. So jumping into damage dealers, I don't think there's that big of a necessity to have too many that you have to have specific damage dealers. I decided to go with Luluca as one of mine, and I also did not super gear her the way that she would need to be for this particular fight. I have Daydream Joker on, which we gained no extra utilization of. The boss also cannot be percentage health struck, so not using Green Bellona is S1 doesn't do extra damage. You're actually not going to get the value out of that. Same with Luluca's extra damage we would be getting from Daydream Joker. We're just getting normal Luluca damage out of it. Reason I picked this character is I really like the ability to just defense break constantly, as well as the exclusive equipment I have on here is the one that gives you a 35% chance to grant you an extra S1. So you'll see a lot of times in these fights, I will actually just be able to double tap a mushroom and kill it really quickly with her. That was the main reason I picked her, was mostly for the just that ability. One time I believe during the fight we did end up using the shielding plus the defense buff, and it was pretty nice. It wasn't necessarily like a clutch thing, but it was pretty nice to have. But again, this boss strips buffs off of you pretty regularly, so it's not that important to actually even have that. It's mostly here, and we chose this character to be able to nuke down quickly mushrooms. The second DPS and the final character for this team that we picked was Seaside Bellona. Honestly, she's not necessary for this fight at all. The reason that she was kind of useful and very helpful here was that when she gets to use her S2 and it does cycle around, she does happen to get a good chunk of defense breaks off, usually on those extra mushrooms, assuming that you have a high enough effectiveness. I'm going to be honest with you. I think that if you were just using somebody like Luluca or somebody else that could give quick defense breaks specifically to the mushrooms, you'd be pushing the boss a lot less. So really, Seaside Bellona kind of screws you over a little bit at the same time that she helps you, because while you're trying to get the defense breaks as fast as you can on the mushrooms that you want to take out, you're also hitting the boss, which is actually boosting the boss forward, giving the boss more turns. When the boss has more turns, you're getting, like, the boss is actually going to buff itself more often. So kind of a double-edged sword here with Seaside Bellona. We decided to go with it, and it worked out. It was no problem. One of the things I would say with her that I did like a lot, though, was the Rhaegar's drink. Rhaegar's drink actually procs super hard on the mushrooms, which is nice because if you hit any of the mushrooms with AoE damage, you don't actually do any real damage. I think you do like 4 or 5 damage. It's super, super small. Whereas after that was done, it'll proc the drink and hit them for like another 1200 in my case, which was like, all right, cool. I'll take extra damage. So the drink is useful. The AoE damage is definitely not useful. So again, with Luluca and Seaside Bellona, the AoE is literally there for like defense breaks only. Beyond that, you're sticking pretty much to your basic single attack. So just like every floor, we're going to go through this fight. There is actually a little bit of like strategy just for getting through wave 1. You can't actually just immediately auto this because there will be enough healing that will heal the first piece. So let's jump into the fight. We'll explain all of this and kind of give you some ideas of how the boss works, so that if you have to change your team comp up, hopefully it's easier for you than otherwise. So as we get into this, phase 1, the order of operations here is not to auto. We had said this just a second ago. Honestly, it's really important that you just kill off the crystal first and then move on to the Astesta, which is the sort of like horned floaty thing. You'll kill that second, and then you can work on the Crimson Ferris like pretty easily from there, not having to worry about all the buffs that are being put up on it or the barriers or anything else. It's pretty easy just to crush them down really quickly. Honestly, phase 1 is not one of those phases where you need to save up a lot of Archies, but at the same time, I wouldn't hesitate to use a lot of your S3 abilities, things that are potentially going to give you more souls up front, because you can never have too many souls moving into this next phase when you're actually able to utilize Archie. So as we jump into phase 2, this is where we're going to start employing some of the strategy of the team and how this whole fight works. So Charlotte, right off the bat, will have her S3. She will res all of her mushrooms, which are the allies that she reses every time she uses the S3. And all of those mushrooms will start to add basically new mechanics to this fight. So things to consider when you're fighting this, each one of those mushrooms has a debuff that will actually debuff the boss if you kill it. Debuffing the boss is the only way to actually do damage to Charlotte, and you can't use debuffs that you would normally have from your team. So for example, if Luluca were to just hit Charlotte, but she had none of the debuffs from any of the mushrooms up, it would do like almost no damage, basically no damage, and would also at the exact same time not ever be able to land any kind of real debuffs. So the debuffs actually don't come from you, they come from the mushrooms. So the whole point here is basically to take out the mushrooms that are going to be most important to be able to put those debuffs onto Charlotte so that you can start actually damaging the boss. Most important 2 mushrooms are the top 2 if you were looking at them as a square. So the yellow mushroom and the back purple mushroom are the 2 most important. The yellow one does unbuffable and the back purple one does defense break. So why are those 2 important? Well, number 1, for the unbuffable, when it comes to Charlotte, every time she takes a turn and she actually completes a cycle of a turn, it will give her a random buff. For 2 turns that's undispellable, so even if you brought in a stripping character, you'd never be able to strip it off. It is actually not strippable, but you can get unbuffable on her, which would then make it so that she's not able to get new buffs for the next 2 turns that she goes. So it does slow down a lot of that ramping damage that can come up with Charlotte, and it's super, super important. So making sure that you sort of control that well is going to be the best way to play. And the way the boss works is you actually have her S1, which is extremely dangerous to deal with, slams the ground to attack all enemies and dispels all buffs, triggering a dual attack from a random ally. Basically, anything that you could buff your team with, she can get rid of on her S1 and actually will trigger a dual attack with a random ally, which usually will defense break you, which is really, really challenging to deal with. It can be a defense down, it can be a blind, it can be, I believe, a speed. There's so many different things it can be, but the defense down is by far the most scary one to have happen. So you want to be able to use Momo to cleanse that off ASAP and always have like an S2 ready for like right at the end of that. S2, not that big of a deal, just decreases some combat readiness on your team, but it doesn't really do a ton of extra damage as long as you've got the debuffs from the mushrooms up, so not a huge thing to worry about. But back to S3, when S3 comes back around, it will actually hit your team based on whatever buff she has at that point. So if she's gotten a lot of buffs because you haven't gotten the unbuffable up, it could really hurt from that. If you haven't been able to get rid of all the debuffs on your team, it could hurt from that, and she could basically wipe your team on an S3 if you're not ready for it. So that's why we have Adamant Shield here, basically internally on your C Armin. That's the same reason why you want to have Arius, so you can have a lot of defensive mitigation as well as like a really strong healer in Momo, which is why we also put Rod on her to give her even that extra little boost of healing. So things to consider here when you're attacking the boss, every time you hit it, it'll increase the combat readiness of the boss. So we talked about how she gives herself buffs, but we didn't talk about the fact that when you do hit her, she actually moves faster too. So the only way to sort of mess with that mechanic is to recognize like, hey, if I need extra healing or there's a lot of stuff going on in the debuff world for my team, I need to be able to kind of slow this fight down. You don't want to hit Charlotte. You want to hit a mushroom. A mushroom will actually make it so that time can go just a little bit more slowly for you because the combat readiness won't push her forward. Basically, the way that this fight is going to work for you is, can I make sure that I'm keeping unbuffable and potentially the defense break down as much as possible? Can I heal through the damage that's coming out from the rest of Charlotte the rest of the time? And how am I actually landing damage? Because unfortunately, AoE damage, you'll notice, doesn't actually do any real damage to your mushrooms. The Rhaegar's Drink will tick, and that will actually do some, which has been kind of nice for the SSB, but actual AoE doesn't. So a lot of with Luluca, we'll be using and debuffing with her S1 and trying to just like single target nuke down the particular mushrooms that we're looking for. But otherwise, it's going to need to be like single target damage almost across the board. And once you start actually getting a debuff on Charlotte is when you can actually start putting down damage on Charlotte, because prior to that, she won't take damage. So the mushrooms and Charlotte sort of switch places on who actually is able to take damage based on whether or not there's actually a debuff on Charlotte, and or if a mushroom is still alive that hasn't gotten the unbuffable up, it will actually make it so that Charlotte can also buff herself at the same time. So it makes sense. If you watch it, it formulaically gets taken down here as we go through. I had a lot of fun with this fight. I do think it was very well designed, and I think that there were a couple of like random pieces in here that add to sort of a little bit of cheesiness that you can get away with. Those things are, again, Rhaegar's Strength, being able to proc and give you extra damage on AoE when you're not technically supposed to be able to AoE here. That's pretty nice. As well as, and I don't utilize him super well here, is Arky. Arky will actually just do his damage anyways in the AoE fashion that he would normally do, so it actually doesn't matter that much if for what it's worth. Like when it comes to AoEing with using Arky, if you've got Arkies up and you want to put some damage in on the boss, you want to put some damage in on mushrooms, go for it. It's actually going to be very consistent damage. And so again, you could potentially just tank this fight up with a lot of healers and like a tank or even two tanks, like 2 tanks, 2 healers, and only Arky this and just very, very, very slow roll it. But I will say that would become much, much harder because you're not going to be able to actually kill off mushrooms, meaning you're always going to, every single time the Charlotte gets a turn, she's always going to be buffing herself, and that could still get to be a lot of damage over time. All in all, if you keep that all in mind and you take those mushrooms out, slowly whittle away at the Charlotte and use Arkies accordingly, you should have this fight no problem, guys. So that's going to be it for Floor 91, guys. A lot of strategy, a lot of fun, honestly, for this particular fight. I like that you can play a lot of different things, but that the strategy still has to be sort of implemented and entailed the same way. I like that. It doesn't seem quite as one-dimensional as a lot of Abyss floors tend to be. So really cool. I loved it. I thought it was good. Guys, if you appreciate this content, you love being able to see it, being a part of what we do here, make sure you like, comment, subscribe. We love hearing from you. We love being able to just like talk about any and all of the things in game, whether it's here on YouTube or over on Twitch. But we will see you guys in the next video. Have a great rest of your day. Peace.